Bring Her Back is the new film from Danny and Michael Phillipous. These are the directors of Talk to Me. While they have more Talk to Me movies in the pipeline, I believe a sequel and a short prequel, I like the decision to make the original IP movie first. You gotta take the chance to make an original movie while you can, and then hopefully you have the franchise as a fallback. But how was this movie? How was their sophomore effort? Well, first here's a quick summary. Following the death of their father, a brother and sister are introduced to their new sibling by their foster mother, only to learn that she has a terrifying secret. No spoilers in the beginning of the video. I'll mark when they start. I'm also going to make a few comparisons to Talk to Me along the way, not because this movie has to be the same as Talk to Me or to do things the same way, but because it is a very similar style of movie, clearly done by the same directors. So there are easy points of comparison in my mind. So overall, I liked Bring Her Back a little. I think it's got some strengths that you might expect from these brothers per their style. I'll get into those strengths a little bit. But I think the main way I would characterize the shortcomings would be the film having a weak identity. Because to me, you can have a regular story, like a concept you've seen 100 times, but just as long as you put a unique stamp on it, then you've made your own version, and that's totally fine. So here are some things that do give the film some uniqueness. One of those is the sound design. Much like Talk to Me, sound design is probably the biggest strength of Bring Her Back. So one of the main features is the way the film approaches horror, which is less of surprise and more of dread. The film generally does not make it a secret what it's going to do. If it has a horror set piece it is going to bring forward, it is usually very clear what the horror set piece is going to be. So what it does instead is kind of confront you with what's about to happen, and you know the generalities, but you don't know the specifics, and it's just kind of flashing you with warning signs. The way it capitalizes on that dread is the important thing. And I think this is a film that has satisfying payoffs for the dread. It's building the idea up in your mind, like that's kind of the whole thing. It's like, you see it's coming, you wonder, you fear what is going to happen in the situation. So the payoff has to be able to pay off the vision you had in your mind and kind of exceed that. The Philippos certainly have no shortage of gnarly ideas and payoffs for things in their mind. So I think this is a perfect idea for them. Certainly a strength, certainly an identity of the film. Second thing that is an important part of the dread is the sound design. The sound design in the film is a strength much like it was in Talk to Me in similar ways. The sound mix is very prominent, and a lot of sound effects are very visceral, loud and punchy, really grab your attention and give you like a feeling of immediacy and a feeling of just the power of whatever event is currently taking place. One of the best examples, and I'm going to refer to a scene that happens in the movie, you could count it as a light spoiler. There's a scene involving a knife, we'll say. The camera, in keeping with the idea of dread, focuses on it very clearly. It's kind of following the knife around more than following the person using the knife. When the knife is in motion, you kind of hear the kind of like the zings and the twings of the wind rushing off it. You hear, kind of like the slicing, the slurpy sounds as it's cutting up this piece of melon. So by the visuals of just seeing the knife so repeatedly and by hearing the knife so prominently, you get an increasing sense of dread. You get the increasing certainty that this knife is going to be used for something. It's going to be bad. You don't exactly know how, and I think in this case, the film surprises you, or surprised me, very effective in the way it paid off that dread. So using another sensory dimension in enforcing the dread, I think is a big high point of the film. And it also manages to bring a certain like sinister quality to something which you wouldn't expect to be sinister, I think, in the film, a main source of fear for the main character. Those are both, I think, points of identity, points of uniqueness for the film. But then at the same time, I think there are a few things that hurt the film's sense of identity. Something that can give the film uniqueness is this particular vision of the Philippou brothers. There's a little bit of a deranged quality to what they cook up. And you can see this in Talk to Me already. There's a similar vision here, though perhaps a little bit less deranged because there's a little less humor to me. I think in Talk to Me, the amount of humor and the quality of the humor adds like this craziness to the film that makes it just feel like the movie is enjoying the wickedness a little bit. And there's not as much of that here, but there is a little bit of goofiness here and there. There's some visceral violence and a couple of strange, gross sort of elements in the film. To me, the reason this source of identity doesn't work out too well is there isn't a performance that quite matches the type of film perhaps this is intended to be. I think if you look at Talk to Me as a comparison, Sophie Wilde is exactly the kind of performance I'm thinking of. She's able to really lean into the wickedness of the film, the wickedness of her role, while still being able to pull back and preserve the more subdued, like emotional quality that still needs to be there to balance everything out. I'm not talking bad about Sally Hawkins' performance per se, but she is the corresponding performance for this movie that would need to have that glue to match the film's ideas. Like I said, I'm not saying she isn't good, but I just don't think she gives quite the life to this character that it needs. I just don't feel the weight and the danger in her performance. I don't feel that her as a character matches up to the things that her character is given to do. So I think that holds the movie back from really being able to fully execute its tone properly. Switch to spoilers. And I've got two main things that I think actively hurt the identity of the film. The single most impactful thing to me is the opening, which I think is very weak. And again, we'll use Talk to Me as a point of comparison. So Talk to Me, I think, has a quality hook. We'll start out with the song, which is basically the first thing we start with in the film.
Hey, coming through this shit.
It is energetic and dark tonally, and energetic and dark are both great words to describe Talk to Me. So we're really setting a tone early. We're describing the kind of film Talk to Me is. Additionally, we have striking execution. The whole scene is filmed in one take. It roves through the party. We get the life of the party while this guy is in contrast, kind of just looking for his brother walking around. And then lastly, we have the climax, which on the one hand ends in a sort of expected way, but also in an intriguing way that leaves us with a little bit of mystery, leaves us wondering why exactly that is the event that transpired. So we've set up tone, we've got a bit of striking style, and we've got a mystery for the rest of the film to tide us over while it sets things up. Good hook. Those are all ingredients for a very good hook. So now let's compare to Bring Her Back's opening. The initial scene has this sort of outsider dynamic where the girl doesn't feel included because of her disability. This initial bit, I think, falls flat to me partially because it's not that intriguing. It's a fairly standard dynamic. I think it doesn't give a unique characteristic, I guess, besides the fact that there's, sort of a unique impairment at play here. But it's also flat, I think, because the dynamic between the siblings isn't immediately captivating. It doesn't show us anything intriguing in the relationships or in the situations we're presented with. I think the siblings are meant to be portrayed as very close, but to me, they come off as a little bit antagonistic. But I think given the events later in the film, it's clear that actually they are kind of besties. They get home after a little more banter that kind of goes along with my criticism of their dynamic. But they get home and they're really the only people of concern at that point. They get home, they find the dad dead. And to me, that's a problem because the dad isn't really established. He just kind of pops into the radar when he's dead. He's not like an interesting dynamic on the way, like a point of concern or anything for them. He just pops up, he's dead. There's no rise in anticipation or anything of coming home to see him or anything. He's just kind of there. And he doesn't die in a mysterious way or anything. Like nothing of that series of events leaves an interesting hook for us to hang on to while the film does setup. It's just kind of something that happens. He's just dead on the floor. It's clear how he died. There's no indication of a mystery about him dying. So there's no hook. There's no real visual style. The thing you can point to, right, is the film does make a habit of using that shallow focus to kind of mimic the girl's vision impairment because she says she can only see like shapes and colors. There are times where it's used to enforce that. But I think the problem is shallow focus by itself is not a stylistic statement. That is a very common aesthetic. You can kind of understand that it is the visual idea based on, her eyes and whatnot, but that's just not a strong statement in and of itself to catch your attention or anything. And then there's no real tone established. I think it just feels like a very generic opening as the sum of these parts. Something just kind of happens and then the movie continues. So I think the lack of identity is really most apparent in the beginning. It doesn't give us anything to hold on to. It doesn't define the movie at all. I think it takes the movie half an hour before it really starts to become something. And then this leads into the second main thing, which is I think this is just kind of a standard grief story. Horror movies about grief and trauma are all the rage, and it's certainly possible to make fresh ones. I think Talk to Me is a conveniently good example because it starts in a place of grief, but it, I think, moves on to something that's much more interesting. And that's kind of the dynamics between living people and the way that grief can kind of cause emotional changes and a desperation to hang on to people. But just, I don't know, to me, like, I just feel like I've seen this style of execution, like the idea of, grief and trying to cope poorly with grief, hurting other people, eating someone inside, stuff like that. I just think this doesn't morph into an interesting version of this idea. And I think that's a big problem because if you look at the other strengths in my mind, like sound design, awesome strength. It's cool to have an interesting aesthetic. The sense of dread, that's cool. But those are not drivers of identity, at least not in this movie. They're secondary pieces. And you've got the secondary support, but they're not supporting anything interesting at its core. And to me, that's just the problem. There are bits of identity that are interesting, but they're not driven by anything strong. And so it comes across, I think, feeling more like a standard film than I wish it would. So I think ultimately, like, what this leaves you with is a movie that's probably worth the price of admission for some sequences. For, you know, if you just want to watch a kind of mean horror movie, I think it'll scratch that itch. It will perhaps not be worth the price of admission to me if you are looking for something unique. Maybe if you're not as much into horror, but you like watching a good horror movie. Or if you're sick of grief horror, this will almost certainly not be for you.